Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the December 2023 ABL Maritime Market Briefing, last one of the year, obviously. Today, we're going to be discussing the role of naval architects in loss incidents, post-risk matters. And we feel that naval architects are slightly underrepresented on occasion on hull machinery instructions, so I'm looking forward to hearing from Paris on this. It's not working here. My name's Mark McGarren. I'm the Global Managing Director for Maritime here at ABL. And as usual, our briefing this morning is accredited by the Chartered Insurance Institute, and delegates can claim up to 1 CPD hour for your participation. We'll therefore keep a record of those in the room today and those of you logging on online. If you haven't done so already, please make sure you sign in with the team at the desk so we can make sure that this list is accurate, and we can follow up with an email with a CPD certificate. I'm very pleased to be introducing the panel today, and Paris has done this before, so we're pleased to welcome back. So Paris Mangriotis is our technical speaker today. He's our Marine Engineering Director, and he's based here in London, and I'm sure he's known to many of you in the room today and watching online. And he'll be sharing his knowledge and expertise on the value added by naval architects in the event of loss incidents in our sector. So thanks to Paris for joining us and for your presentation coming up. We also welcome back Shrey, who is a maritime project engineer on the ABL Engineering Development Scheme. Shrey is working with Paris's team at present in London and is presenting today's case reports of high-value casualties from the past month. So thanks to Shrey for stepping in to do that. Incidentally, any of those out there who are online who might be interested in joining our engineering graduate scheme, applicants are now being taken for September 2024 intake, and more details can be found on our website. As usual, the usual caveats apply, Chatham House rules apply, and please remember that the information contained in today's presentations and any opinions and comments expressed are those of the presenters and not necessarily of ABL. At the end of today's briefing, can we please ask everyone to take 3 minutes out of their time to complete the online survey? This is very critical for us so we can keep our presentations and our offerings valid, but it also helps us keep our CPD accreditation so we can continue to offer this to people that need it. There's a QR code on the screen, and there's some more QR codes outside, and we'll also be emailing this to you after the event to follow up. So before I pass on to Paris, another reminder of the Neptune Declaration on seafarer wellbeing and crew change. Many of our own colleagues here on the team have seafaring backgrounds, so crew welfare is a cause that's close to many of our hearts. And as such, ABL is proud to be a signatory of the Neptune Declaration, which undoubtedly has played a part in the improvements of the lives of seafarers today, and will continue to do so. So if you do have an opportunity to take a look at this on behalf of your company, please do. So I'm now going to hand over to Paris, who's going to do our technical presentation.
Thanks, Mark. Today I'm going to cover the role of the naval architect in loss investigations. We have some learning objectives here. The real objective of this presentation is just think about when you need a naval architect, but this is summarized succinctly there. So who am I? I'm a consultant naval architect for 18 years. I've previously been a marine surveyor. I've acted as an expert witness in a number of different naval architecture related cases. I've acted as a project manager on wreck removals. Previously I worked for Class. They say you shouldn't allow a particular job to define your identity. But I'm generally known within the company as the guy who did the Costa Concordia for LOC, our previous company, at project managing it on behalf of the relevant insurers. And you'll also find me as a contributing author to the guidelines for collecting marine evidence by the Nautical Institute. Okay. There are, as Mark briefly mentioned, a naval architect might be instructed pre-risk. So that would be for attending a condition survey, carrying out marine warranty surveys, or surveys of facilities such as the JH143. But this presentation is going to focus on post-risk cases, damage surveys, casualty management, incident investigations, just some of the topics that a naval architect would be involved in. Okay. So there's some audience participation, unfortunately, for you guys today. But I thought to make it topical, and really the structure of this presentation is, I thought about, well, what are the causes of loss? And luckily for us, Allianz Commercial produce an annual report. Currently, the person responsible is Pathak Shriram. So thanks to him, he's allowed me to use their statistics. And my question to the audience is, based on the last 5 years of insurance claims, that's 245,000 claims worth 9.2 billion euro. I'm not sure if that's euros or dollars. What would you think are what would you think is the most expensive of these 5 categories? So I'm going to ask the audience in this room for a show of hands, please. It's purely for the glory of winning. There's no prize, but who in this room thinks machinery breakdown would be the top cause in value? No hands. Okay. What about shipping incidents? Is this category? It covers everything really, from sinkings, collisions, groundings. Anyone want to go for that? Oh, quite a few hands. I think there's about half a dozen. Natural catastrophes. Don't see many, but very expensive. 3 hands for that. Thank you. Fire and explosion. Yeah, again, about half a dozen. Yeah. And finally, cargo, damaged goods, handling, storage. 3. Okay, so it's fire and explosion, 18%. So well done, anyone who put their hand up for that. Followed by shipping incidents, value, of course, not number of incidents. Damaged goods, machinery breakdown, and natural catastrophes. The remainder, 32%, are in other categories, which are not defined. So it's a useful report that now includes causes as well as just reporting on total losses. So the idea was, well, I looked at this list and I thought you could probably have a naval architect work on all of these cases. That's what I thought initially. When it came to writing the presentation, there's some aspects that I had to really think a bit more deeply about. Okay, so starting off, I'm going to go through basically some examples and case studies that I'm familiar with for each of these categories. Fire and explosion. Why would you need a naval architect? Well, in some cases, such as the Carnival Ecstasy on the left, quite an old incident, it would be to determine the extent of repairs, to assess whether, for example, the cabins need to be can be repaired in situ, or an entire section of the hull needs to be prefabricated. And maybe even determine whether it's a total loss. On the right-hand side is the Maersk Honam on fire. The cause was said by the TSIB report to be a container, or more, actually 54 containers with a cargo called SDID, sodium dichloro something or other, that was dangerous. So how a naval architect in such a case would assist with the salvage methodology, perhaps advising salvors on flooding of compartments, ensuring the stability and strength of the vessel remains intact. And on this particular incident, there was a float onto a heavy lift vessel, which would require a Naval Architect's to analysis. And it was Maersk, being uninsured, decided to repair this vessel by cutting it in half, scrapping half of it, and fabricating a new forward section. So that again would be the Naval Architect's domain, quite unusual. Yacht fires, on the other hand, are much more prevalent. And in such a case, as well as assessing whether it's a total loss or not, I think the Naval Architect might be involved with an assessment of the suitability of the fixed fire protection system, things like fire installation boundaries. Presently, lithium-ion batteries are an increasing cause of concern, and that's led to guidelines about fixed fire protection. The guidelines always seem to follow incidents, so rather like SOLAS and the Titanic. But that's an area that Naval Architects would be involved with. The second highest category was shipping incidents, and I've tried to dig out our most dramatic grounding photos here. On the left was in Spain, the Maro in 2008. On the right, the Lisbon seaways off the west coast of Scotland that some of you may remember. So this is sort of the bread and butter for Naval Architects, really, coming in and determining whether or not the vessel can be refloated, how, perhaps doing hydrostatic calculations, strength calculations, really trying to assist with the recovery as best as can be. And of course, when it comes to repair, assessing the most efficient way to do it and ensuring it's done in a cost-effective manner at the correct yard, as well as assessing the tow or transport to the repair facility in terms of stability and strength of the casualty. Sometimes the grounding becomes a total loss. In this case, it's the MV Server in Norway, one of the first jobs I was involved with. And that would be for the Naval Architect to assist with the recovery of the broken sections, perhaps advise on recycling. The Hoosaka was a grounding off Southampton on the Bramble Bank. And this was a case where the vessel was recovered by adjusting the loading condition, i.e. filling various ballast tanks to bring it upright. We were instructed on behalf of cargo interests in this case, and that leads me on to the next category, which is damaged goods. So I thought, well, the top category for this for us is container loss, really. This is, again, where Naval Architects are frequently involved. So keep your eye on this white container here. Footage taken from the bridge. Not particularly heavy weather. Containers topple overboard. And in this case, a Naval Architect would be involved in assessing whether the stowage was correct, whether the lashings were in order, perhaps trying to identify the root cause, and if that was perhaps defective equipment or poorly maintained equipment, in order to maybe come to a conclusion about liability. So for many years, this has been a sort of ongoing problem for the industry, but during the first winter of COVID, there was a huge spate of incidents, and we see there's 2,675 containers lost over a 3-month period, and that has been put down to unusual loading conditions during that period of time, where cargo was, the normal flows of cargo were interrupted. But it's a fact that modern, very large container ships are designed so that the range of roll motions has to be maintained within a very strict window. So sometimes class recommend only up to 13 to 14 degrees of roll, because you've got maybe 9, 10 tiers high of containers. So again, the naval architect would be involved in the perspective of assessing the stowage, and clearly it's not easy to discharge some of the damaged containers. The cargo within can be severely damaged. Now, this was probably the most difficult category to assess why you need a naval architect. And if there are any marine engineers in the audience, they'll probably object. But it's really the interaction of the fluid forces around the ship, which might be a cause for bringing in the naval architect. Traditionally, the propeller and rudder are considered the domain of the naval architect. And with the increasing focus on ship efficiency and the CII, which is the carbon intensity indicator, we're finding that the propulsion systems are being altered, larger propellers, which are more highly loaded, and these can cause some unexpected effects like damage or increased wear to stern tube bearings. And a naval architect may be involved in the investigation of the hydrodynamic forces on the propeller. In this case, a computational fluid dynamics model was commissioned to understand how the forces on the propeller acted during turns, and really, was this a guarantee issue or something to do with the particular operation of the vessel? Likewise, the rudder pintle bearing is frequently a very sensitive component. In groundings, it's often damaged, and you may need a naval architect to assess the relative forces that might have been experienced during a grounding contact. Again, this might be to determine the root cause of damage, whether it's can be linked to a particular incident. And here we see a finite element strength analysis model of a rudder blade that we undertook. But generally, a naval architect might be involved in anything that requires calculations, such as structural failure of cranes, crane wires, gears. They're all aspects that really a naval architect would assist with what is in traditionally a marine engineering discipline. Okay, the final category that we had from the report was natural catastrophes, and this really, I had to do a bit of head scratching here, going back in time. But one of the most dramatic natural catastrophes would be the 2011 Japan tsunami. We see the photo on the left. A number of vessels were left high and dry. and Naval Architects were involved there with assessing the wreck removal methodologies, doing some of the tender assessments, where there was an option to run a competitive tender for the removal of some of these vessels. On the right is a damaged jackup rig in the Gulf of Mexico. This is going even further back, Hurricane Rita 2005, where 111 fixed platforms were destroyed. 59 more were extensively damaged. All of the Gulf was evacuated. At that point, they were left unattended. But that created an almighty mess that had to be cleared up, unless they were left as sort of fish sanctuaries. I don't know if any of them became that. But again, Naval Architect would be involved with the methodology for the efficient removal of jackups, which are notoriously complicated structures to remove. They require cutting up, and the legs specifically can be very hard to remove from certain bottom types. I haven't included photos here of yacht marinas, but that would be an area where our colleagues at ABL Yachts are deeply involved with, although I understand that hurricane cover is not a standard in the Caribbean, but nevertheless, that's a frequent cause of damage. And I'm also told that lightning strikes now are becoming more prevalent with changing weather patterns. And in such a case, Naval Architect might be involved in looking at things like high-tech carbon rigging on some of the modern mega yachts. That concludes the examples that I had for you today. And I hope we've covered some of the learning objectives, as well as telling you all about the sorts of things Naval Architects do. And Katie, are we taking questions now, or is that at the end? Right, so it's an opportunity for any audience questions, and to congratulate yourself again if you guessed correctly on the top cause of loss. Yes. Sensors and cameras that are pointed at the cargo that can help determine all sorts of things. Yeah, that's it's an interesting point. I'm not aware of any sensors other than well, not even the vessel's VDR would record roll motion, which is unfortunate because that's a really important parameter for the investigation. So generally, we'll be looking at crew observations of maximum roll. You can determine roll angle in a roundabout fashion if you have sufficient VDR data and you can actually see the swing of the antenna. So it can give you some idea, but this all from the perspective of investigating after the loss. Doesn't give you any indication of, oh, I'm in a dangerous situation. The masters ought to be trained and maybe have tools which will predict whether or not they'll be entering a dangerous area from the perspective of parametric roll. So certain ship speed, direction, and wave height and period combinations, like going into head seas which have the same length or exactly half the length of the ship, they're known to be dangerous. So that's not really a sensor, but it's a form of prediction of whether you're in danger. I think those would be the sort of precautionary measures I'm aware of. Right.
A question that we've had, are they go under failure investigation using microstructure and root cause analysis?
Could you repeat the first part of the question, Katie?
Are there go under failure investigations using microstructure and root cause analysis?
Yeah, I think maybe that's a metallurgy question. The microstructure aspect, that's all I'm aware of, and unless there's any other terminology, in which case we would try and bring in a metallurgist if that's a root cause of an incident to look. And the naval architect might determine the extent of the sample that needs to be removed from site and taken to the metallurgical laboratory. In terms of root cause analysis, there are certain methodologies which are laid out for doing a formal investigation. Usually they're a bit too prescriptive for what we do, where we'd be acting normally for an insurance client, but they can form some use, things like a particular sort of flow chart where you go through contributory causes. It can be a useful way to structure an investigation and structure a report. Yes. Okay, thanks for that. So that question was about the prevalence of container losses and the sort of spike that we saw during the first year of COVID. It certainly hasn't continued at that rate. That seems to have been an anomaly. But there does seem to be an increasing problem, let's say, compared to a decade ago when we didn't have so many ultra large container vessels. When we do get these losses, they tend to be larger now, obviously, in terms of the number of containers lost. But I think there's also more, as I said, the range of motion of permitted roll motion is reduced, and now some class societies are even permitting a reduction for short voyages. So I think it's a continuing industry problem, but certainly not at that spike that we saw back in 2020, 2021. Thank you.
There is one more question. I'm not sure if we'd be able to comment on it though, so just say, but I'll put it. Or were there any key learnings from a naval architecture perspective from Maersk Honum?
Yeah, I'm sure they were. But then you're right, Katie. It's not something that I would want to comment on right now, especially as I personally wasn't that closely involved in that particular case. But thanks for the question.
No other questions.
All right, great. Well, thanks for that. And over to you, Shrey, for the case reports.
Thanks, Paris. So, am I audible? The purpose of this section of the briefing is simply to show you some of the higher cost cases recently that ABL have been involved in. This will hopefully show you or remind you of the sorts of incidents and casualties that can happen in shipping and marine operations. But first, just a reminder of what these so-called case reports are. So they feature largely, but not exclusively, the higher cost hull and machinery casualties with estimated costs of repair in excess of $250,000, usually excluding the salvage cost. They cover only a subset of the total ABL caseload, which of course includes many other areas apart from just hull and machinery, typically between 10 and 20% by ABL case numbers. And these case reports, nevertheless, are a significant subset of our hull and machinery work. For although they account for about 20 to 25% by number, they cover about 65 to 75% by cost. Be aware that estimated costs given are often preliminary and subject to further investigations and inspections. In presenting these case reports for the last month of activity, it's not about attributing blame. We just aim to convey what happened, so we won't be giving any definitive conclusions about the causes. As many of these cases are still fresh, it wouldn't be appropriate to do so, and most of these are still under investigation anyway. As usual, let's start off with some statistics. So I've been notified of 13 high-cost cases during November, and the blue columns in this chart show the proportional distribution between those 13 types. So that's 3 machinery cases, 2 accommodation fires, which we just learned was the most common case, 3 collisions or contacts, 1 heavy weather case, 1 rudder horn cracking incident, 1 expensive pod problem, 1 very expensive damage to coatings, and 1 lightning strike. The last 2 involving super yachts. As always, with such a small sample set, you are bound to have a few gaps in the distribution that you see here when you compare it to the distribution for the whole year. That's 2022, given in the gray columns in the graph. Now we've added in the distribution of those 13 cases by their total costs. And you can see that the pod and coating damage cases have caused a couple of big spikes this month. The total estimated repair costs for the 13 cases is about $15 million, and that puts the average cost for November at $1.1 million, just above the typical annual average background figure of about $1 million. That's, of course, the figure that we've seen over many years in face value terms when excluding extreme losses of $50 million. So let's have a quick look as to how the cumulative annual totals are shaping up to be. You can see that the cumulative trend for the distribution of the different casualty types by number is shaping up to a similar pattern to last year and indeed previous years. Here's the distribution of the total costs, and we can see spikes in some of the categories where we might expect them, though not all. You can also see that the average casualty cost for the year presently stands at $970,000, very close to the historical level for these higher cost cases. We'll talk more about all of these in the next couple of months when the 2023 statistics are completed. Let's look now at some of November's cases in more detail. We've selected 8 of them if we have time to get through all of them. And bear in mind that although we say these are November cases, the month generally refers to when the first advice comes in from our surveyor. So some of these cases might actually be from earlier months. First up, we have this 19-year-old reefer vessel that was in a European port loading sacks of potatoes when one of the crew noticed smoke coming from the captain's deck at about 6 o'clock in the morning. The alarm was raised, and shortly afterwards, the officers and crew started firefighting with seawater hoses. By 7 minutes to 7, the fire was extinguished fully, and no one was injured. Let's go on board and follow our surveyor around. So there's nothing terribly obvious from the outside. Some indication of smoke and burning around the window of the pilot's cabin that was being used by the reefer engineer. Here, we're about to enter by the aft entrance to the captain's deck, or deck number 4. Again, only minor smoke damage. And in the passageway, again, nothing terribly obvious from the photos, but there is heat and smoke damage to light fittings, speakers, vents, and smoke detectors. With most fires, the source can usually be found by tracing back to the worst affected areas of burning. The worst affected cabin was that described on the plans as the pilot's cabin. As I said, this was being used by the reefer engineer. And here we're looking towards the forward bulkhead on the accommodation front. And that's the window we saw earlier. That's the bed and the fittings. And that's looking aft towards the door. Here by the window, we're probably looking at the seat of the fire, where a surveyor found the remains of an extension lead and a kettle. The reefer engineer said he put the kettle on before leaving his cabin in the morning. Homing in closer, I'm told that this is the remains of the extension cord. And that's the kettle. So it's probable that there was some sort of a short circuit in the kettle or the extension lead. And thanks to the crew's effort, the direct effects of the fire were limited to just 3 cabins. This and the master's 2 rooms. But looking more closely upwards to the damaged ceiling within the pilot's cabin, we see lots of scorched wiring. Some of this wiring is for equipment on the bridge, which is directly above. Still on deck 4, here's the state of the master's day room. And other spaces in the area were more affected by heat and smoke and efforts to extinguish rather than by flames and burning. So that's the electrical switchboard room across the alleyway. That's the communal toilet on deck 4. You can see that soot and grime around the sink and walls and the toilet rolls. That toilet doesn't look great, and to be honest, I suspect it didn't even before the fire. So the direct damage has been reasonably well contained by the firefighting efforts. And there are no reports of any structural distortions to the deck or deck head plating, which is very good news in terms of costs. But up on the bridge, they found that lots of kit didn't work or didn't work properly due to being damaged by the damaged wiring that we saw in the deck heads below. And here they found that the fire alarm panel was affected as well. Likewise, the main engine control telegraph, radars, and radios. But all in all, the estimate of $290,000 is still very modest for an accommodation fire compared to many we've seen before. Now, I must tell you that our attending surveyor has also sent me pictures of the ongoing restoration works on board. And I was very pleased to see that the owners have sorted out that uninviting toilet. Much more welcoming now. But just to assure you, our attending surveyor also told me he won't be approving any claims for the toilet pan replacement in the costs. Okay, so next up, we have a disturbing story of a very close shave by the small fishing trawler. The crew were beam trawling off the coast in European waters when at 2 o'clock in the morning, they noticed a general cargo ship on an intersecting course about 3 miles away. As the stand-on vessel, the little trawler maintained her course and speed and tried to contact the cargo ship, but with no response. As the distance closed, it was clear that the general cargo ship was not slowing down or altering her course as required by a give-way vessel. And in the end, the trawler had to make a sharp turn to starboard to avoid a collision. In the end, she was hit and got dragged along the cargo ship's starboard side, making multiple contacts on her port side before they finally separated. She's only a tiny thing, and though cargo ships are not huge, the one that hit her was, well, at least by comparison. I've tried to put the 2 images of the vessel side by side to illustrate the point that the little trawler was ever only going to come off worse. Following the incident, the crew tried to recover the wires and nets, but the deck gear would not function, and in the end, they had to cut the wires and abandon the fishing gear in order to get back to port. In this picture, you see some of the more obvious damage to the gantry and port boom. And that's some deck distortion from the impacts. And that's on the port bow. You can see impact marks and scrapes from something colored blue. As well as visible damage like this, owners suspect shaft misalignment and damages to the main engine. The propeller was noticed to be out of line with its caught nozzle, and heavy vibration was noted when underway back to the port. The estimate given here is an awful lot for a small vessel like this, but I'm told it's a very worst case figure where the main engine and hydraulic systems and so on are assumed to have to be completely replaced, which is unlikely. The total cost is more likely to be about half of this, but it's still an awful lot for the size of the vessel. But I suppose we should bear in mind that it could have been a whole lot worse. The vessel could have easily been capsized or pulled under in the circumstances, with lives being lost. This 13-year-old Panamax-sized bulk carrier was on a voyage from Northern Europe to an East African port where she got caught out by heavy conditions in the North Sea. She tried to deviate, but the weather deteriorated and she reportedly encountered Beaufort 10 conditions for 3 days, peaking to 11 to 12, with 12-meter seas and 13-meter swells. I'm told that the maximum recorded wind speed was 79.5 knots, a bit higher than that shown here. Green seas were reported to be rolling over the forecastle and main deck during the whole period, and at one point the ship had an effective backward speed of 1.2 knots as she tried to keep her head into the wind. After things calmed down, the vessel continued on her way, but stopped in a port in Spain for inspections, which is where we see her now. Here we see, or rather don't see, her starboard side accommodation ladder that has been lost overboard. And that's some damage and bent deck railings. But we pause here for a moment, and you'll notice the close-up of one broken section of the handrail. Some of the areas of the ship where damage occurred also exhibited significant corrosion. This raises the old quandary about whether some of the damage and losses would have occurred had there been no corrosion, with counter-arguments that regardless, the damage wouldn't have occurred had it not been for the bad weather and so on. Anyway, other damages include a bend in her embarkation ladder and broken pipe clamps and foundations on the exposed deck piping to the side of the hatches. Here we also see that in some areas, the ballast lines have contacted the fire lines. And that's a crack in a weld of a ballast line where it goes below the deck. Plus, we have damages to hatches and main hatch cover control equipment and losses of fire hoses and lifebuoys from the main deck. And attachment of cables and so on. From the description of the weather conditions encountered, it sounds like this was close to a 10-year return event in the North Sea. Ships are, of course, designed for more than this, and it's good to note that there was no reported problems with the main hull structure. Moving on to the fourth case, we have a very beautiful and very expensive 2-year-old super yacht that was in dry dock for her first class intermediate survey. One day, the crew noticed that their precious charge was covered in paint overspray spots. By looking around, I understand it wasn't hard to identify, but was somewhat harder to believe that the source of the spots was from painting that was being carried out on an old fixed crane at the rear of the dock without any denting protection. I understand that the overspray has also affected another super yacht in an adjacent dock, just for good measure. Now, what is it about ABL surveyors? Can they not resist taking photos of themselves when they pass any mirror-like object? To be fair, on this occasion, our surveyor is actually trying to take a photo of the paint splatter and streaking on the transom with its very high gloss finish. You might just be able to see the dots. There's a lot of interested parties involved in this case, including lawyers, of course. And here we see a cherry picker being used to inspect the topsides. Here's some microscope photos of the spots on black and white surfaces, which are not amenable to simple cleaning. And it's looking like perhaps 70% of the hull and superstructure will have to be recoated. This would be several millions of dollars worth of repairs unless a less painful solution can be found. Okay, another accommodation fire now, this time on a new dive support vessel being built in a South Asian yard. The vessel was undergoing final fit-out before sea trials when yard staff noticed smoke coming from the forward portside entrance on deck 3 of the accommodation block. This was at 20 past 6 in the evening. The fire alarm was raised and a fire team was mobilized to the vessel while vents and power to the affected compartments was shut. The fire was finally extinguished by 8 o'clock. So let's again follow our attending surveyor. His immediate impression as he boarded the vessel was not good. Here he noticed that there were 2 fire hoses placed on board for firefighting, but neither were kept charged or even connected to the hydrant of the fixed show fire main. We see one of the hoses dangling over the ship's side with the other end wound around a bollard. Despite that, the extent of damage seems to have been restricted to a storage compartment on deck 3, where the fire is believed to have started, plus the surrounding alleyways, plus a 2-man cabin and adjacent alleyways directly above on deck 4. The cause of the fire is under investigation, possibly a short in the temporary wiring passing through the space. Here we see burnt bed bunks and packaging which were being stored in the compartment, along with insulation panels and other furniture. Unlike the earlier fire case, the heat has caused deformation of both the deck and deckhead plating of deck 3, plus the usual damage to overhead cables. Here's the typical compression buckling of the deckhead plating caused by its expansion in the heat. And that's as seen on deck 4 above. In view of those unprepared fire hoses we saw at the beginning, you can't help but wonder if some of this $350,000 worth of repair costs could have been avoided. Next, we have $315,000 worth of damage to the fenders at a European port due to Storm Kieran at the beginning of November. This is how the fenders looked before a cross-channel ferry sought shelter alongside during the passage of the storm. All nice and even, and importantly, fully attached. Here's a photo taken by port staff during the storm when the vessel had to be pushed against the quayside after a number of mooring lines broke with the combination of high winds and high tide. In the right-hand photo, you can see some scrapes of the ship's hull where it has contacted the steel-facing panels of the fenders. But the quantum here is for the repairs of the fendering, not the ship. 2 of the 6 fenders need to be rebuilt due to fractured bolts to the lower rubber compression pads and broken restraining chains. I understand the very high tide meant the ship's belting was bearing against the fender-facing panels above the upper rubber compression pad, which they weren't designed for, causing overtension in the lower compression pad bolts. Moving on, I think this is the last case. So some of my colleagues would say, what a silly idea pods have always been. Yeah, they might help a ship's stability by being heavy weights low down, and they might free up some space in the hull so you can fit another casino in a cruise ship. But sticking 2 big, very expensive and sensitive electric motors in little compartments and dangling them below the hull, surely that's asking for trouble. Anyway, in the case we have this month, you'll be pleased to know that they haven't been ripped off the 4-year-old cruise ship to which they are attached due to a grounding or anything like that. Rather, during a biannual inspection of the units, the starboard pod was found to have damage to its thrust bearing. Let's orientate ourselves. In the photo on the left, we see a bit of the unit that is included inside the hull in the engine room for azimuthing the unit, and so on. While the diagram to the lower right shows the bit that's under the hull. Now, you can climb down a bit into the pod and do some inspections as the figure shows. But if there's a problem, there's not much fixing you can do because of the very limited space. The problem they found in this case is some sort of scoring on the rollers of the tapered roller bearing at the non-driver end of the rotor shaft. How is this a thrust bearing? Well, the angles and tapering of the rollers provide longitudinal restraint to the shaft in both directions against the thrust of the propeller, as well as normal lateral restraint. This means that the drive end bearing can be a simple roller bearing for just lateral restraint and can concentrate on supporting the much higher lateral loads experienced here due to the weight of the propeller. The cause of the damage detected is under investigation, and repairs require the ship to be dry docked, the pod taken apart, and the aft bearing replaced, all amounting to a few $1 million worth of repairs. And in the meantime, until they can sort out a dry docking, they have to severely limit the operation and load taken by the affected pod. Not something that you want to worry about when you have lots of cruises booked and very unforgiving schedules. Thank you.
Thank you, Shay, and thank you, Paris, for that. There's one more. Do you want me to do it? There's one more. Do you want me to do it? Well, I've not read this, so bear with me. Right, finally, we have another vessel that was undergoing an in-water classification survey in port, again revealing a serious problem. This time it was a 10-year-old Handymax bulk carrier, and the problem was that her rudder was very close to breaking off. Here we see her in dry dock after a 60-mile controlled voyage down the coast with a tug escort to be a floating dry dock for repairs. The upper picture here shows the rudder is connected to the lower end of the rudder horn by a pintle bearing. Any lateral loads on the rudder in normal operation will cause high bending stresses where the horn intersects with the main hull. Any poor design or flaw in this area could result in high stress concentrations and fatigue crack initiation and growth. The pictures below show the cracks found on both sides of the rudder horn close to the hull. These extended about 2/3 of the length of the horn's cross-section. The longer the cracks are, the lower the effective steel section will be to resist bending loads from the rudder onto the horn. The higher the stresses will be at the critical section of the horn, and the faster the cracks will grow. And here we see restoration underway. The hull is being cropped on both sides adjacent to the rudder horn plating that extends upwards into the hull. This now gives access to cut out and renew the cracked plating. But notice when you do this sort of thing, you have to be careful not to effectively cut off the part of the vessel that you're sitting on. See the two large steel beams angled at 45 degrees? These have been welded to the hull and to the lower part of the horn on both sides to prevent the horn breaking off when the side plating is cropped out. In this view, you can see this plating to be replaced, which is outlined in red. The smaller area in green is to be sent off for metallurgical examination to try and establish the cause more definitively by examination of the fracture surfaces. And did you know that there was a plug in the rudder? Here, the yard staff are trying to remove it to see if there's any water inside the hollow structure that is designed to be buoyant to minimize the loads on the rudder stock, horns and pintles. Had the rudder been full of water, this could have contributed to the damage. When they eventually got the plug out, it was all nice and dry inside, so everything seems to be pointing back to a flaw in design or a flaw in the construction of the rudder horn itself. That is it now. That was the last one. We do have a winner from last month, but he's not here today. It's Paul Cunningham, who many of you know. So we'll have to get the bottle to him at some point. But there'll be more questions following up. We'll be sending questions out for this briefing as well. Thank you very much for everyone who joined us on today, both online and in the room. Here's the QR code again for your feedback. And as I say, we really do appreciate your feedback because it helps us make sure that we're delivering the right sort of things for you guys. Our next briefing will be the 11th of January, same time, 9:30 here in the Old Lloyd's Library. And we'll be advertising that on the website and social media for more details. And as is our tradition, we'll be kicking off the year in January with Paul Hill's Maritime Roundup of 2023. And we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.